Hi, it's Martin. Welcome to this week's episode of the Business Stuff podcast. Today I'm with Emma Walker from EW Estates. Hi Emma, how are you doing?
Hi Martin, thank you for having me.
Tell me a little bit about what you do and then we'll get on to this week's topic.
So I'm an RICS registered valuer and surveyor, and I run a firm of surveyors based in Ashington, doing residential and commercial surveying.
Excellent. And this week we're going to be talking about things that people in business need to be aware of when renting property, or they have property and they're going to rent out spare space to other people, or they could be a commercial landlord. So we're just going to talk about the commercial letting of property.
Yeah, perfect.
Is that okay?
Absolutely.
Excellent. So I suppose most people's experience will be that they've rented a house off someone, or they've got a house that they rent out.
Yeah.
And they probably think, unless they've got any other experience, that commercial's much the same, but it's not really anything like it, is it?
No, it's not. There's lots of laws within residential lettings that mean that the tenant is protected, whereas actually the onus has shifted in commercial, and the tenant has a lot more responsibility than what you would be used to in a residential AST.
So because residential tenants are kind of consumers, they're protected by a lot of regulation about how to handle deposits, eviction notices, why you can and can't get people out, the length of the agreements. There's a whole load of protections for residential tenants, but commercial, so you just said that the onus is on them. Yeah. It's just, we're in business. If you do a bad deal, you do a bad deal.
Absolutely, yeah.
You can't just go, well, that wasn't fair.
No, and
if
also there's no comeback.
Yeah,
once you sign it, it's a legally binding document and you're bound by the terms, and there's no stipulation about what those terms need to be. There's no specifics in terms of law as to what deposits need to be, where they need to be held, how much they are. It's very different in resi.
So if you accidentally sign a document that says there's an extra couple of zeros, or there's a full stop missing in the figure, you could be committed to 10 grand instead of £1,000.
Absolutely.
And it's legally binding, and you're relying on the good faith of the other party to agree.
Yeah,
but you're otherwise in, aren't you?
Yeah, so it can only be amended on the agreement of both parties.
So what's the main difference then, Emma? So, I mean, there's a whole bunch of things, but the first one that might catch people out is repairs, for instance. If I'm renting a house out and you're my tenant, the roof blows off, I've insured it, probably, hopefully. It's up to me to get a new roof on. I wouldn't expect you to put a roof on.
Yeah.
If you kick a door in, I might be a bit annoyed. I might ask you to do that. Mm-hmm. But maintaining the property falls to the landlord in resi. What's the scenario with commercial?
So it's really different. So mainly in commercial, and it depends on the property, I would say most leases are what we call FRI, which stands for fully repairing and insuring. So you are responsible for the whole building, internal and external. So in a commercial property, if the roof blows off, you would hope it was insured. But if it wasn't, it would be down to the tenant. If that's what the lease says, it's down to the tenant. There are some leases where you're just responsible for the internal, and there are some leases where you're also not responsible for the insurance. It depends on the lease, but most are where the tenant is responsible for everything. It's not just me boiler's gone off, I'll ring the landlord. It doesn't work like that. Yeah,
and there's no kind of standard, is there? There might be something that's common practice and things that happen more than others, but basically if you're given a lease as a business moving into a property, you've got to basically read every bit of it, because it's not, you might be renting a shop next door to another shop. You could have a completely different lease, entirely different rules, all based on who's written it, who's put it in there.
Yeah, and you could have two properties owned by the same landlord, rented to the same type of tenant,
or even the same tenant,
yeah. And the two leases could be completely polar opposites. You could be responsible for all repairs in one, and you could be responsible for no repairs in the other. You must make sure that you get advice at the beginning, and actually don't wait until you've signed the lease and it all goes wrong. Get the advice at the beginning.
Yeah. It's much easier to amend before you're in, because actually there's a lot of things that commercial tenants going into a property can negotiate on, which we'll come on to later, which you can only do before you get in, things like rent voids and rent-free periods, etc. But that's an aside. So repairs, and you mentioned fully repairing and insuring.
Yeah.
Most again, resi tenants would think, well, I'll insure my TV, bed, furniture. Yeah. They wouldn't insure the property.
In commercial, in most cases, again, normal leases that we see day to day would be fully repairing and insuring. So you insure the whole building, and so that's include the building and your contents, not just your contents, which you're used to in resi. Or alternatively, the landlord would insure the building, but you would be responsible for the cost.
And they would pass it on,
and that catches a lot of people out.
Because the good point there as well is, because we're going to try and cover this from landlord and tenant. Mm-hmm. if you're a landlord renting it out, don't just assume the tenant's got it insured.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
Because if they don't and it falls down, yes, you can sue them, but if they haven't got any money, your building still fell down, hasn't it?
Yeah.
So it's quite normal for the landlord to cover the insurance, but then just pass the full cost on, isn't it?
Yeah, and even in buildings where there's multiple units, that cost is just normally split, so normally the landlord would insure the whole building, but tenants A, B and C would pay the percentage of the floor area that they cover.
The pay towards it, yeah.
Yeah, and there's no reason for the landlord to pay for any of that. The cost is normally passed on to the tenant, and that normally catches tenants out because they're just expecting to pay the rent, but actually there's additional costs.
They forget, yeah. I mean, are there any other costs as well? Things like, do service charges come into this as well? Is there other things that will be passed on as part of a normal routine?
Absolutely. So if you've got common parts, so for example, an office block where you've got multiple offices in the office.
You might have like a shared office type thing where there's a reception that's shared across 10 different businesses.
Or even something simple like an entrance hallway. Someone's got to look after the entrance hallway. Someone's got to look after the roof.
Yeah, it doesn't even have to be someone sitting there, does it?
No. It's just the building. So what you might find is that there'll be a service charge. And again, it's proportioned normally by floor area. You pay a percentage and it's passed on to the tenants. And again, that's in addition to rent. It comes as a shock to many, but it's normally always written into the lease.
So if you're renting a small office in some beautiful old building with beautiful grounds that are maintained, you're going to pay for a share of those grounds.
So the rent might appear cheap on the advert.
Yeah,
or
it's 100 quid a week, but there's 100 quid a week service charge.
Yeah, and there could be more than that. I've often seen cases where the service charge is actually higher than the rent.
Oh, that's interesting.
So, and it just catches people out because people just aren't aware that it's coming. And a lot of people know that there's a service charge, but don't ask to see the budget. So actually you want to know what the service charge is and what it's been historically. And
again, there's no comeback here. It's not like there's a consumer protection. No, if you enter into a bad deal, you've got a bad deal.
Yeah.
And that's it.
The thing with service charges is you've also got someone to manage it. So you've normally got a managing agent who then adds their fee on, and again, that's split by the tenant. The landlord's not expected to cover that just because he's having someone manage it. It's split between the tenants.
So it sounds all glory and money at the moment, being a commercial landlord.
We're not selling it really, are we?
It can't be, there must be some downsides to being a commercial.
I don't know, do you know what it is? I think commercial is difficult, especially at the minute, because I think there's lots of people able to work from home, and I think that's what people have learned. So there's a lot of empty commercial property. Yeah. The voids are longer, the incentives very different. So you talked about before about rent-free periods. Quite often people are getting 6 months rent-free. So the landlord's not got his building, but actually isn't taking any rent for that. So it's not as glorious as we may paint it initially.
There's also some other things which we'll come on to as well. So what if... I'm trying to think of the main differences here then again. So in a resi property, you would normally get a 6 month assured short hold tenancy, which is the normal thing. They're normally no longer than a year. I think a year, 2 years is the absolute maximum I've seen. And in fact, I think if there's a mortgage on the property, I think the lender would normally say you can't have more than a 12-month tenancy. But in commercial, you can rent a property for as long as you want, can't you? You
can, yeah. So there's certain rules regarding if it's over 10 years that it has to be registered with the land registry. Yeah. But that doesn't stop them from granting a 10-year lease. From a landlord's perspective, I suppose the longer the better, if that tenant's secure.
If you think they're going to pay the rent.
Then that makes sense. But actually from a tenant's perspective, it's about protecting your business. We don't know what's around the corner in 6 months' time, let alone what's around the corner in 10 months' time. So you might want to potentially look at a break clause. Yeah. So you might want to sign a 10-year lease, but you might want to have a break at years 3 and 6. So know that actually you're only really signing up for 3 years and 6 years.
You're committing to a minimum of, say, 3. Yeah, but if you want to stay till 6, you can. If you want to stay till 9, you can. And again, that's part of the barter. The landlord might want a break clause. You might just say, well, I want to stay here unless I choose to go. Yeah. And again, it's just part of the price negotiation, isn't it?
Yeah, and it's all done in the initial stages. So it's about setting out what you want right at the beginning. Before you've signed the lease, you can't then decide, I need a break at 3 years. It's not how this stuff works. It needs to all be done in advance, and you need to do some future planning. Yeah. A lot of commercial leases will also have protection from the Landlord and Tenant Act, which basically means that at the end of a commercial lease, a landlord's not necessarily entitled to just take his property back. Right. In some cases, you're entitled to renewal because the idea is you've built a business there. So if you've opened a cafe, for example,
and it's built a customer base well,
and it's doing really well, and you've come to the end of the 10-year lease, the last thing you want is your landlord to say, not renewing, sorry.
I'm going to open a cafe there.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. You want to be able to negotiate your position and make sure actually that you protect your business. Yeah. So that's really important, and that's something again that catches so many people out.
Yeah. Okay. You mentioned there as well the fact that you might need to register a lease with the land registry. It's also worth bearing in mind again that on residential, there isn't normally anything to worry about for things like stamp duty, but leases can actually have a stamp duty charge as well on the person entering the lease, can't they?
Yeah.
Especially if there's lease premiums and things like that. So it's always just worth bearing in mind there might be an additional cost there you weren't expecting. So we've talked about the relative lack of consumer protection. There might be something in there that gives certain rights. But again, if you're in business, you're deemed to understand what you're doing and only sign stuff that you're happy to sign. We've talked about the repairs, the insurances. We've talked about breaks in the lease, the length of lease all being different. So what kind of stuff would normally go through a negotiation point where, let's say you want to open a cafe in my property, I want you in, but I don't want to give you everything. What's the kind of considerations that would go through there then?
So we'd be talking about things like a rent-free period. So businesses are expected, in most cases, because they're looking after the property, to want to do a fit-out, to want to embed their business.
So this cafe, so you're wanting a cafe at the minute, it's empty.
Yeah. So I'd want to build a kitchen.
You've got to kit it out, haven't you?
Yeah, exactly. I'd want to put tables, I'd want to decorate. So actually, I would be asking for a rent-free period.
Because you don't want to pay rent while you're not even open.
No.
So you might spend 2 months kitting it out, spend 100 grand on it. You don't want to be paying rent at the same time.
No, and it's about those initial discussions and actually what do we want to do. There'll be discussions regarding whether we can assign the lease. So actually, if I want to sell the business, can I assign the lease to somebody else?
Cafe is going well. Yeah. You want to retire, sell
it on.
You don't want me to be able to block that.
Yeah, exactly.
And that's assigning the lease, yeah.
Absolutely. Things like re-entering clauses. So for you, if I decide I'm not going to pay the rent, you need to be able to get back into the property and reclaim possession. In residential, that's a really long, drawn-out process. But in commercial, quite often, it's 14 days and you're out.
We used to have an insolvency department here, actually, who literally seized a pub chain and a hotel chain. It literally happened overnight, a minute past midnight. Mm-hmm.
So
people were working for one person the day before and were literally working for somebody else the next day. It was crazy.
Don't get me wrong, there's processes involved, but it's much quicker and it's much more cutthroat because you're expected to be running a business.
Because you're in business,
expected to be signing a lease.
Business be hard, yeah.
Absolutely, yeah. In other things, you would look at rent increases. So actually, just because you've signed a 10-year lease doesn't mean that the rent's not going to change.
Because I might have a mortgage.
Absolutely.
Interest rates have just gone up. I need to have some play there.
Yeah, and rent increases can take two forms. So they might be fixed. So I might say to you, well, actually, after 5 years, I'll increase it by X amount of pounds. Or actually, what I might say is I'm going to increase it to market value. Well, that just leaves the floor wide open. Catches loads of people out. So
you could have took a 15-year lease in a bad area.
Yeah.
It gets gentrified. All of a sudden, there's people spending £4.80 on avocado on toast.
Absolutely.
Come to your 3-year rent review. Mm-hmm. It's
going to market value.
It's going to increase, isn't it?
Yeah. And actually, that increase can be exponential at times. So
you've got to make sure you're making the most of the fact. You've got to make sure your business is growing to accommodate the area around it.
And it's also for landlords. It's about making the most of those rent increases where you need to. So if you've got a rent increase,
because you might only get one every 3 year, 5 year, 10 year.
And sometimes if you miss it, the time's gone. You can't go back. In some leases, they allow you to go back, but in majority, they don't.
So me as the landlord, if I've got a 3-year rent review, 2 year in, I've got to start thinking I've got to get this valued because there's probably a format,
there's
a process. So I've got to come to you before the 3 years and go, this is what I think the rent's going to be.
Well, in some leases, you have to serve notice in advance. It has to be a specific number of days in advance. If you miss it by a day, you're out and your chance is gone and it's tough.
You've missed,
and that's the same from the tenant's perspective with break clauses. So they might have a break clause in, but if you don't serve notice 30 days, if you serve it 29 days, it's tough. Yeah. You're there for another 3 years.
And again, it's not that you can't get out, but it's a barter.
Yeah.
If I've got you and you've got to give me 10 grand a year, and you say, can I get out? I might let you out, but I might want 15 grand.
Absolutely. And some landlords just...
And then I'll just rent it out the next day. Yeah. But again, if you want out, you're committed to 30 grand in that example.
Yeah.
If you can get out for less than 30...
Absolutely.
You've got to persuade me, haven't you?
Yeah. And also, as well, what you've got to remember is that you would then become liable for the property. So as the landlord, you might let me out for 15 grand, but then you're stuck with the property, and what if it doesn't rent?
And
it's different if the demand's
rates
high.
And
and you're liable for all of those costs. So actually, it's definitely a bartering exercise. And I've seen landlords where they've just not been able to accept that because they've been liable for various costs.
So let's just say you've persuaded me, you've got a great business case. I might have asked to see your cash flows, what kind of kit out you're doing, what it's going to look like. Because again, you've got to persuade me to let you to enter a deal. So you know, when you move into a house, they don't normally ask too much about you. They just want to make sure you're going to pay the rent, you might have a job, and that's it. But the landlord might really want to know what you're doing. Let's say you've persuaded me, we've got a 3-year clause, you've paid the rent, you get to the end of the 3-year, and you say, right, I'm going to move out. And I didn't really want you to run a restaurant in there anyway. You move out, am I stuck with a restaurant?
No. So again, another just catches people out so many times. So actually you need to make sure that in the lease, and again, it depends on what the lease says, but in most cases you return it as you found it. So I might have spent £3 million kitting out this most beautiful restaurant that I think's amazing and that all my customers think are amazing, but you think it's rubbish. I have to give you it back. So actually it could cost me another £1 million to take it all out.
You've got to give me back the way it was.
Yeah.
And a lot
Before
of people,
I fitted it out.
Yeah, because we've seen this a lot. They go, but I've left it in great condition. It's not about the condition. It's about if I rent you a shop that's just got a glass front and bare walls.
You want it back.
I want bare walls.
Yeah.
You'll take all your crap out.
And again,
take all the aircon out, take the toilets,
down,
literally everything out. Yeah.
And some landlords will want it back the way they got it. So for instance, if I'd put in a new kitchen because I was running a restaurant, you might want the old kitchen back. So where do you store an old kitchen for 3 years? It's those kind of things that sometimes
and
catch
people think
out.
we're just being petty, but this happens all
it happens
the time.
All of the time. And also it's about having proof. So actually, have you had an inventory and a schedule of condition done at the beginning to confirm this was? You might get in and find that the boiler doesn't work. Tough. You've signed. It's your responsibility now. So
again, we're talking here about the tenant's perspective. Landlords, again, I might have bought a commercial property and I say, I'll write me. We'll just write something, Emma. Leave it in a good condition.
Yeah.
What the hell does that mean? You might leave me with a shop that in 3 years' time is literally an illegal activity, and I've got a very well kitted out shop that I've got to then pay to take it all out just because we didn't get that right at the start.
Yeah. And it's actually your perception of what
I don't know what kind of illegal activity we're talking about, but
you never know. But your perception of good condition would be different to my perception, as would everybody else's. So it's
which is why it's leave it empty, bare walls, bare floors,
and photograph what it is. So even if you don't have a full schedule of condition done, take your own records, make sure they're date and time stamped, make sure they're signed by both parties.
Both parties the same.
Because actually then you can go back and say, but this is what it was like, and there's some proof, and you're not just guessing what good might mean. Or what you meant by good.
Because if the contract says we both agree it's in good condition at the start, leave it in good condition at the end, well, we've got pictures of what you think good was at the start. You can't now change the rules and say, well, that's not very good.
Yeah.
Like, that was good enough at the start.
And as well, if you
have again, good condition should never be anywhere.
No.
That's a terrible, because it's too vague, isn't it?
It is, but actually you should refer to the photographs you've taken. Yeah. So this was what was taken on this date and this is how we want it back. You have to be really specific because otherwise you leave it open for kind of interpretation and nobody interprets things the same. So
let's say then, because you might say, well, why would anyone want an old kitchen put back in? And you probably wouldn't. But if this was a bar, for instance, with a beautiful old, 150-year-old wooden bar, they might go, well, yeah, you can lift that up and move it, but I want that in. If the trendy wine bar doesn't work and I want the Queen Vic back, I want that back in.
Yeah. We've just had a case where there was an old safe. So the tenant thought it was useless to them because they weren't running a bank.
Just in their way.
But the landlord, it'd been essence 1905 or something. The landlord wanted it there.
Attached to it,
yeah. And actually it's part of the building. So it's...
And if they were renting to a pawnbrokers or something like that, might be handy.
Yeah.
Keep all the valuable stuff in there.
It's then discussing, well, who wants it and who doesn't. But actually the landlord set out in the lease it's to stay. And unfortunately for the tenant, it has to stay.
And if you don't want that, that's not the property for you, is it?
It's tough,
or you just say, well, if you want that, I can't use that room, I'm going to pay you less. And again, it's part of the barter, isn't it?
It is, yeah, absolutely. But it's about getting it clear right at the beginning.
So we've talked. So again, we've gone into quite a few areas there on the negotiations on the way in. We've talked about negotiating the length of the lease, the break clauses, the importance.
Yeah.
Is it a two-way break clause? Is it a rent review? If it's a rent review, can they only go up or can they go down?
They can go down. Depends how well it's written.
Because the landlord would go, we'll have an upward only rent review.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And
you would go, well, what happens if the market crashes?
Yeah.
Sorry.
So as a landlord, what you'd probably want is an upward only open market rent review with if the RPI index is higher than market value, so it's going up either way.
So as a minimum by an inflationary increase,
Yeah.
or if higher,
It's
the
going to
market
market
rent.
value.
So if it's now gentrified, it's more than RPI.
Yeah.
If it's worse, it's
going
still
up
RPI.
anyway.
Who
Yeah.
cares? Yeah.
And most landlords would write that into their lease.
Yeah.
But on the tenant side, obviously, you don't want that in. That's the worst case scenario because it's definitely going up.
Yeah.
What a lot of people are doing and what we're finding is that they're fixing the rent increases at the beginning. So they're going to say at the end of year 3, we're going to pay X. At the end of year 6, we're going to pay X. And then everybody knows what's happening.
Yeah.
And it's not then, well, what's the market going to do? What's inflation doing?
Okay then. So we've talked about ins, outs, rent reviews. We've talked about insurances. We've mentioned there might be service charges. Just thinking there is quite often the unusual position that you might be both the landlord and tenant. So a lot of our clients put their own commercial properties into a pension, for instance, and they then think, well, we'll do what we want then. But they ignore the fact that the pension trustees will still want to see a commercial lease. If you've got a mortgage, the lender will still want to see a commercial lease.
Yeah.
And you can actually get in a funny position where you're almost arguing with yourself, can't you?
Mm-hmm. And there's lots of regulation around that in terms of who manages the property, who looks after, who collects, like how is the rent collected, who is monitoring the lease and how is it monitored. And I think that's really specialist in terms of getting advice. So don't try and do that on your own, and make sure that you're getting advice all the way throughout the process on both sides. Yeah. So a lot of, surveyors can't act for both parties, but what you want is someone acting for the pension fund and someone acting for the business.
Yeah. And you may say, but I don't care. It's my pension, my business. But it's not about that. Pensions have trustees who need to be seen to be acting in the right interest of the fund. Yeah. It's not your interest anymore, it's the fund's interest. Where do people go when they're then looking at things like the value then? And I don't mean the value of the property, although I am going to come back to that because there's an interesting point there I think it's worth clearing up. But I just say to you, I want 10 grand. People, you might not know or be able to find out what the neighbouring shops are paying. You wouldn't know if that's good, bad, or whatever. How? So
sometimes the rental value isn't determined like residential is. So it's a 4-bed house would technically be worth more than a 3-bed house in the same street. Commercial doesn't work like that sometimes. So if, for instance, Asda want to take a unit and then, I don't know, I want to take a unit who doesn't have a business that's very well known. The chances
Let's assume they're the same size, same...
Yeah. All other aspects are the same other than the business type. But actually, Asda might pay a lower rent because it would bring more people to the area. If the landlord owns multiple properties in that area, it would bring more demand for his properties. They're presumably also seen as a safer bet. Yeah, absolutely. There's less risk involved. So you talk about this idea of a blue chip tenant in commercial, don't you? If you can get a national, a Boots or something like that, you're probably safer, aren't you? Yeah, absolutely. And it's actually rental value is determined by lots of things. There's various databases that we use as surveyors to kind of calculate kind of rough ideas and get comparables. But in terms of valuing for rental, it's always best to get advice and not necessarily use what the neighbour's getting next door, because the lease might be a year's lease, whereas you've signed a 10-year lease. Rent's very different. Yeah, because again, if you're renting a house next door to someone, you've both probably got a 6-month normal short-hold tenancy with similar, you've got absolutely no idea, have you? No, and the thing with commercial as well, there's lots of things written into the lease that people might miss. So the neighbour might be telling you he's got a 10-year lease and he's paying half what you're paying, but actually you've got a break at the end of year 1, which he hasn't. Or he might have a landlord repairing lease and you've got a tenant repairing lease, or vice versa. Yeah. He might not be paying any insurance on top, you might, Yeah, there's so many variables that actually each case needs to be assessed individually, and it's about all of the bits. So the repairing element, the insuring element, the length of the lease, the break clause, the rent. So he might have, the neighbour might have the same shop, but we might be paying half what you're paying, but actually he's got a rent increase clause that states his rent's going to double in a year's time. Well, actually then you've got the better position. They're not like for like. He might have 3 rent increases coming over 10 years. You've got none. You might have none. Yeah. Absolutely. And again, broken record, but it's all part of the barter, isn't it? Yeah. Couple of quick questions then, just to finish off then. Are there any rents, I'm pretty sure there are, but I can't off the top of my head think of the kind of industries where they are, where they could almost be like a turnover rent? Yeah, so possibly like restaurants, cafes, pubs, bars, that kind of thing. The better you're doing, the more you pay? Yeah, So that would be based on a percentage. So it would probably be with a minimum. So this is what you pay regardless of what you take. And then there might be an increase based on how well you do. So for example, a pub in a city centre would probably have something linked to turnover because that location is in high demand. Whereas a pub on a residential estate would be very different.
Yeah.
So yeah, they happen more in industries where it can be controlled based on location and property than other industries.
Yeah. Okay. Then you get in the unfortunate position of having to report your turnover to your landlord, so you can then have that fight.
Yeah.
Which again,
and also
why would you want that? Yeah.
And also prove it by way of audited accounts.
Yeah.
Again, normally for probably the bigger firms.
Yeah.
And more blue chip tenants like you talked about.
Yeah, yeah. And so I put something on my LinkedIn probably 6 or 8 weeks ago now. I've never met a landlord yet who would want to leave a property empty. I was talking about residential because people don't want to pay double council tax and their mortgage. But in commercial, often the value of the property can be determined by the rent you get.
Yeah.
And if you've got a high property value based on the last time you got an evaluation, you were getting 20 grand a year. If you put someone in there on 3 grand a year, that's going to affect your valuation when you come around to remortgage, isn't it?
Absolutely. And it can cause lots of damage. So actually just renting it to anybody for a cheap rent isn't the way to do it. There might be other alternatives, splitting it or looking at different marketing strategies, but sometimes just letting it to anybody as cheap as you can get it can have adverse effects on other elements.
So this is why you see, there are some huge commercial that they're empty.
Yeah, because it's
But
easier.
actually it would cost them more money to have a bad agreement.
Yeah, because if they had, someone paying £1,000 a year, it would make a huge difference in terms of a market value for investment purposes because the rent's so poor, but actually the landlord's tied himself into that. Yeah. So we're all talking about tenants tying themselves in, but if the landlords tied themselves in, you're stuck with a tenant paying £1,000 when the market rent's £10,000, for example. Yeah.
And actually, I know in big business, I mentioned before, Boots might be a safer tenant. It's not that they don't close stores. It's just they're probably going to still pay the rent. Yeah. So again, it's not unusual for people to pay rent and not use the property because it's cheaper than buying out of the rent, isn't it?
Yeah, absolutely.
So there's a lot of really unusual stuff happens in business that people it's a whole new world, isn't it?
Yeah, and even properties that you see that are empty might still be tenanted. Just like you said, just because the business isn't there and present anymore doesn't mean that there's not somebody paying rent and looking after the property, because even though you've vacated, you're actually still responsible for the property. It's different in residential where you ring the council and say I've moved out and you're no longer responsible for council tax. It's not like that in commercial. You're responsible for the period of the lease, for all of the repairs, even if you're not trading from there.
Just as the very last point then, there was an interesting scenario when people were getting the rate rebates or support under the COVID support schemes, where if you qualified for 100% small business rate, you got a rebate. Yeah. But actually there was a lot of people who'd never actually registered for business rates. Because you kind of have to register and then apply for the exemption, don't you? Yeah. And there's a lot of people who'd never registered, so then really struggled to try and prove that they were there to get the grant, didn't they?
Yeah, so for business rates, you have to register and then get the discount. And
you don't just assume you're paying on?
No, so it's not as simple as just, even if you're eligible for 100%, you still have to register and have it deducted, because otherwise you end up in situations like that where you can't prove that actually you're a tenant at that point.
Yeah. Obviously really you might have a lease and you've got,
But they were really strict, I think, councils in terms of who'd registered.
We don't just want to give 10 grand to every Tom, Dick or Harry who said, I had a lease.
I was a lease, yeah. I held that lease.
Honestly, Governor, we had a lease.
Yeah, it's definitely about registering and then applying for the discount. And councils are really good at giving advice in terms of business rate discount. Yeah. But just make sure that you've registered initially and you've told them that your business is trading from there.
Just before we go, then, if you could give people one really common thing that happens all the time from a landlord and a tenant perspective, what would you?
For me, it's the break clauses. So even if there's a break clause, you must adhere to the terms. So if the terms say you must serve notice in writing, sent by pigeon with a black cross on its head, and it doesn't get there by pigeon with a black cross on its head, you might as well have not bothered. Yeah. And it catches people out all of the time because they think they've done what's right in the lease. But actually, if the conditions haven't been met clearly, and you have to be able to prove that.
Because the classic there is, I know of, it's very common to say, well, yeah, you can get out of 3 years, but you've got to give us a year's notice to get out at 3 years.
Yeah.
Why? Well, because if it's a business, people don't just move in and out of business premises all the time. The landlord's going to need time to prepare, get ready, and find someone to move in. So you might think, well, I know I can get out in 3 years. Yeah, I'm like 35 months in. Nah, it's not working. Oh yeah, can I get out?
Nope.
Sorry.
You can't.
You've missed that shot by 11 months. So it's quite hard. You've really got to know what's going on.
Yeah, and it's
'Cause you've
also
got to
about
commit.
diarising. Because actually 3 years is a really long time.
Very easy to forget, isn't it?
Yeah, and you might know that you've got a break in 3 years, and you might have read that it needs 6 months' notice. But then, like you just said, you get to 2 months before and you think, right, this isn't working, I need to get out. But you've missed the boat completely.
Yeah.
And it's actually about reviewing what your future projections are and not just what's happening currently.
Because a business isn't like renting a house where you just move back in with your mother.
Unless you want to turn it with all your restaurant furniture. It's not quite the same.
Mum, can you get rid of that table and chairs from the dining room? I've got this industrial oven I need to just put down there and just stop eating me cakes out.
Start knocking the walls down in your mum's house. It's not quite the same, so yeah, you've got to be prepared.
And can you move your car off the drive? The delivery guys need to get in to take the bit. Yeah.
Yeah, it's not the same, unfortunately.
So you've got your breaks, and I suppose, are you giving that as a tip for landlord and tenant?
Both.
Both be aware.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And actually for landlords, don't let a break clause catch you out. Don't think that you've got a 10-year lease and then your tenant serves you notice that's valid at year 3.
Yeah. And actually, just on that then, it's quite interesting because if the value of a commercial property is so closely linked to the value of the rent agreement, if you're buying a commercial property, don't get caught out when you pop in and say to the tenant, you got 10 years left on the lease.
We're leaving at the end of the month.
But also they go, I've got 10 years. We love it, we'll never move. But if they've got a break clause coming up in 6 months' time, you might buy a property based on a tenant that's not going to be there. Yeah. So again,
and that even happens with blue chip tenants.
Important.
So the people in the store might be telling you that it's a wonderful store and it's really busy, but head office have got other plans. They've already served notice, they know what's coming, and actually their plan is to relocate that store. There might have been a shopping centre opened. Whatever reason it might be, you've got not a leg to stand on as the landlord. Yeah. So even if you're buying it and you think there's 10 years left, what you might find is if the break clause is in 6 months, you need to confirm that they haven't exercised that right. Yeah,
and actually I would imagine it wouldn't be unusual for a tenant to have a break clause on the change of ownership, for instance. Is that something that could be in there, or would it generally not?
It generally wouldn't.
I mean, if I wanted it in, it would be in, wouldn't it?
Absolutely, yeah.
Doesn't mean it's not.
No, and don't assume that it would never be, but it's not something that's commonplace. Yeah. But you can put in what you want, to be perfectly honest, as long as it's not against the law. Yeah. You can put in whatever clause you want in a commercial lease, and that's what catches people out. Yeah.
So I suppose your final tip is just get some advice.
Yeah, get someone else. And if you're not going to get advice, get a couple of people to read the lease. Because at least then you've got a couple of people reading it and you're not missing something that's glaringly obvious.
And if you don't know what it means, make sure you both know and get it cleared up before you sign it.
Yeah, don't do any signing until you've done lots of reading.
Yeah. Before you put your signs up, I'm sure there's an awful pun there, but I can't think of it. If anyone watching or listening's got a way of building in a pun around putting your signs up on the shop before you've signed it, let me know.
Yeah, but I might do a better job than us.
But I haven't got any. Well, listen, Emma, that's been great. Thanks very much. If you're about to sign a lease, you've got a tenant, anything to do with commercial, where can people reach you?
www.ewestates.co.uk.
On your website.
On your website, please.
On the website, the link will be in the description. Thanks, Emma. That's been fantastic. Hope you've enjoyed that. As always, please subscribe, leave comments, like, share the video. If you want to reach out to either of us, please do. And we hope you enjoyed that episode. We'll see you on the next one.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.